terrific, Paul. Thank you so much. And thank you for bringing that music to this day. Music makes everything better, right? But particular Bach, it was Leipzig, and it also raises that question, that unanswerable question, which is, how did a society that brought you that and that music bring you these memories? You can't answer that question, but it puts it together for us. Today, the date is November 10th. November 10th, this is 2024, but 86 years ago today was the day that the world found out what the Germans were capable of doing. If you look in a book, you'll see that Kristallnacht, the event we're going to be speaking about, was November 9th, but it was Kristallnacht, as in the night. So it wasn't until the next morning, being November 10th, this day, this hour, that the world found out about this. By the way, it's incredibly gratifying to see this many people this interested in this event, this day, this subject. I think that we should all be gratified, because this is a time when we need to pay attention to what's going on in the world. And it is great for me, and I think we all need to be congratulated to some extent for showing the interest. You could be in other places, it's a beautiful day out there, but you chose to be here. So I'm going to be telling you today a story which I've titled the 100-Year Family Story. And the question that you could ask, and you should ask, is how do I know the story and how did I get here? And I will tell you that some of you knew, and some of you who know me know that my parents, both of them, were born in Leipzig, Germany. They came here independently, but my father had an interesting characteristic. He had a lot of them, but the one that's relevant to today is he believed in documentation, in hard copy documentation. So my father, when he would receive correspondence from someone or some organization, he would save it. He'd put it in a file somewhere in a drawer and kept it. And by the same token, if he wrote you a letter, he would type it. And he would type it using an old function, which is CC, as in carbon copy. So he kept those copies, and he kept that practice up through his entire life, always wanted a hard copy, and always kept them. Now, he didn't display them, he didn't share them with us, but he kept them. So my father died in 2012 at the age of 92. 4 years later, my mother died, and at that point, it was time to clear out the house. So when you clear out the house, you get to the boxes, and you all know the boxes that have your stuff from junior high and pictures like that. But in those boxes, suddenly I realized that there was a story to be told. Documents and documents which detailed his history and the history of the times. So as I tell you this story, I'm trying to tell you the big picture story, not just my father's story, and I'm going to let you extrapolate the big picture out of that. So what we have today is what I'm going to say is a 100-year story. The principles of this story, I like to go back to this famous statement, stated by a gentleman by the name of George, or I'm supposed to say Jorge Santayana, who wrote that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. It's a famous statement, and as I think about it today, I actually have to question this and say, you know what? I think people need to know the story first, because I'm afraid right now that people don't have anything to forget. They didn't know it in the first place. But that's one of the basic principles behind why I'm speaking today, that we need to keep these stories alive. And the other one comes from our Haggadah. It's the 30-minute Seder, which is a reflection of my religiosity. But there's an important point here. And the point here is that I know that there's people in this room who know this story or know the details probably better than I do. I got historians in here. I got professors in here. But my point here is that what's said here in this Haggadah, excerpted here, is even if we know the story well and have told it many times, it is essential to be reminded of the details so we don't forget. So if you know the story, it's still our obligation to transmit it, because if we don't, who will? You know, if we don't tell it, then these stories will be forgotten, sterilized, minimized, or, God forbid, denied. And we know how that's going. So anyway, allow me now to introduce the principals here. The principal is a building, and this building sits in the middle of Leipzig. It's a building that is known as the Königsbau, and I'm going to explain all about the Königsbau as we go along. The Königsbau translates into the King's Building. You will see, if you look at this, you will see that this is in Leipzig, and you'll see the name Bamberger and Herz. I have to go German on that one, and we're going to speak a lot about that, so that by the time we're done with this, you will understand why I'm highlighting for you the Königsbau, the King's Building, which sits in the middle of a very prominent spot in Leipzig. These are my parents. Some of you knew them. My mother, Margot, and then here's my father, who anybody in this room who knew him as Henry James Bamberger. Henry. But really, Henry James Bamberger wasn't Henry James Bamberger. Henry James Bamberger was born Heinz Jakob Bamberger. And I put his date of birth up there for a reason, and that will become relevant later. Born in 1920, September 8th of 1920. Now, my father came from a prominent family in Germany, a family that owned stores, Bamberger and Herz. And I'm honored today that we have part of the Herz family here today. But Bamberger and Herz was a chain of department stores, men's department stores, in some of the major cities of Germany. And there were cities such as Cologne, I'll bring out my pointer here, Cologne, Frankfurt, Worms, Stuttgart, Munich. München is the German word for Munich, and then Leipzig itself. And you will notice if you look here that Leipzig, right there, Leipzig is in the east part of Germany. So the reason that Leipzig fell off the map is that, like I say, fell off the map. The reason that we don't know a lot about Leipzig is that Leipzig was in the east, in the Soviet bloc, and consequently out of sight, out of mind, the way much of Eastern Europe was. That was the chain of stores, and to put it in perspective to show you what we're talking about in terms of magnitude of these stores, these weren't small little stores. These were not tailor shops. These were big. This is the store in Munich, in a very prominent location in Munich, and I want you to pay attention to something here, which is these archways, because they're going to come up in a little bit. That was a store in Munich. This was a store in the city of Cologne. Same thing, major store, major corner, major property, major men's clothing store. These people, they're all my father and his brothers, my father's father and his brothers. These are the people that my father dubbed die freundliche Herren, which means the friendly gentlemen, plural. And this character on the side here, this is the iconic marketer of the business. It was called der freundliche Herr, singular, the friendly gentleman. So my father dubbed these people, all of whom were his father and uncle, he dubbed them die freundliche Herren. There was my father's father, whose name was Ludwig, his uncle Fritz, his uncle Gustav, his uncle Heinrich, and his uncle Max and his uncle Heinrich. Now all of these people decided at one point that their business was very successful. So it was time to expand. So they decided that to expand, they were going to expand to the city of Leipzig. Now this is an artist's rendering or architectural rendering intended to show what was going to happen in the year 1911. In 1911, they were going to open this store, and this store was going to be called the Königsbau. Why the Königsbau? Because the Königsbau sits on a plaza, a major plaza in the middle of Leipzig, one of those classic European plazas, and it's called the Augustusplatz. Why Augustus? Well, Augustus was a king of the region of Saxony. And he was a heroic king, so they decided that the plaza, the main plaza in Leipzig, needed to be named after him. It was therefore called the Augustusplatz. So if you're going to have the Augustusplatz, and then you're going to have an important business or building on that plaza, you should name it the King's Building. So that's why this became the King's Building. the Königsbau, known always as that. Now, going back to these gentlemen, the friendly gentlemen, plural, in order to create that business, they established a corporation, the Königsbau AG. The Königsbau AG is what we would, if it were this country, we would call it incorporated. But this is the AG. So what happens is that no one individual, this being my grandfather, he didn't own the store. He just was part of the ownership of this group. Why am I telling you that? It'll come up later. So that the Königsbau building was owned not by an individual, but owned by this corporation, the Königsbau AG. What did it look like? Well, it looked like this. You can see here, Bamberger here. This is probably from the teens because they're all you know, either horse-driven or people-driven vehicles. Look like this. This is a picture of, again, the Königsbau. You can make out the fact this is Bamberger and Hertz here. By this point, there's motor vehicles. And that's the way it looked. This was in the 30s. So my father, if you can imagine that his parents owned these kind of stores, probably had a privileged life, and he did. So as a privileged kid, he got to travel. So they traveled to places that you know, places like Venice. And this picture here, this is on the North Sea. This is my father and his little sister, who we'll talk about, his little sister whose name was Steffi. And they had a nice life. That was really nice. They were able to do things like travel, and my father liked to ski. That's how he learned to ski. Here's my father, my grandmother, and my grandfather. And there's an important piece of information here, which is the skis, which is my father has skis, my grandmother has skis, but my grandfather doesn't have skis. He has a stick. He has a cane because he had some disability. We don't know exactly what it was, but it definitely impaired his mobility such that he wasn't able to do things like ski. That'll become important as we go on. So that was the 20s and the 30s. 1933, Adolf Hitler officially came to power. And Adolf Hitler, when he came to power, one of his first activities was something called the boycott. And I told you about the arches. Those are the same arches. This is the Munich store. What you're seeing here is them plastering or gluing to the side of the delivery truck the word Jude, and you can see that's actually what was there. And it's a very orderly presentation, a very orderly activity. Some people like this version better, and I will tell you that after it, I have the actual original pictures of this activity. People stare at it and they see all kinds of interesting things like this woman here, and you can just see that this was a very pleasant day for them. And that was 1933. I told you that this family was prominent. They had stores all through Germany. But this activity, combined with these kinds of signage, this says, you know, attention, kauft nicht bei Juden, and these were the kind of posters that would put on street signs and kiosks. These little stickers were placed into packages, and my father actually remembered that they would be stuck in the package. People would buy something and they would open it up and see that later on. So that's 1933, 4, 5, that's what's happening. The Jews are being persecuted, business is being taken from them, and business was reduced significantly, but somehow the Leipzig store and the Munich store were able to carry on. The other stores were not. They were sold, and their businesses closed. That's 33, 34, and then comes 35. Anybody recognize this? These are the so-called Nuremberg laws. So as the Nazis and Hitler formalized their programs, they needed to define what a Jew was. So this is genetic. This is not a question of what you believed or what you ate or whether you went to services or not. This was all genetic. And the easiest one to look at is over here. These represent the grandparent generation. So being Jewish was defined on the basis of how many of your grandparents were Jewish. So if you had 4 Jewish grandparents, you were Jewish. There's no way out of it. That's a blood issue. You're stuck there. Okay? Same thing if you had 3. You are still Jewish. Doesn't matter what you do, where you go on Saturdays, what you eat, or anything like that. If you were in the middle and you had one or two grandparents, that made you a mischling, which is a mixed person, and then it was a little bit different in terms of how you were defined. But the main issue here is that this is genetic, and it's based on the concept of race, that the Jews were a race. But the other part of it is that in order to enforce laws, you have to have a definition of who's the one you're enforcing, who are the Jews here, and that's how they defined it. I'm sitting here with a cousin, and I believe, Bob, I believe your cousin was your grandparent was a dentist, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you were a dentist, a physician, a lawyer, you were no longer able to practice. You could practice to Jews, but you couldn't practice outside of Judaism. That was a law, okay? The other part here is this one. You might be interested in this. It's called race shaming. And these were signs that were throughout Germany, race shaming. And the race shaming here, if you look at this stereotypical, rather horrific image of a Jewish man relating, if you will, to a German woman. That was illegal, punishable by imprisonment or death. And it went the other way too, which meant any kind of relationship with a non-Jew and a Jew was punishable by imprisonment or death. All based on blood. So, now there's another thing. What do you do in school? Well, school was such that there was no rule that said you couldn't go to school as a Jew. You couldn't go to public school as a Jew. I show this. If you're imaginative, you can figure out that that's my father. And my father here, I like to point out, is as the son of a merchant in the men's clothing world, is the only one with a suit and tie. You got it, right. This was a mixed class, and again, there was no rule that said you couldn't go to school, to a public school, if you were Jewish. However, if you did, you were subject to ridicule and persecution. So for some, the option was to stay in school and suffer. Some people had no choice. There are others, such as my mother and other families, and Michelle Gold's mother did the same thing. They went to the Jewish day school in Germany. You could have done that. But my father and my father's family were such that they said, for little Heinz, who was a wonderful student, they said, it's time to go abroad. So they sent, not abroad, that's the wrong term, go out of the country. So they sent him to a prep school in the French part of Switzerland. And that's where he went at age 15 and spent his teenage years there. 1938, the time's passing here in 1938 early. Here you have the rules of passports and names. By passport, the obvious one is the J there. The one that's not as obvious is this middle name. Now this passport belonged to one of the Freundliche Herren. This was Siegfried, otherwise known as Fritz. Siegfried Bamberger actually was Siegfried Bamberger. He was not Siegfried Israel Bamberger. But the rule was if you were Jewish, you needed to adopt the name Israel. And so every one of your communications had to be Israel, similar to my father's uncle Gustav, who then became Gustav Israel Bamberger. That's the rule. That's how you had to, that's how you had to write. For women, a little harder to say, but my grandmother's name was Olga, and Olga was not Olga Sarah, but that was the rule for women. You became Sarah or Israel on all your documents. Now that is early of 1938, and as I told you, we're talking about 86 years ago, and Kristallnacht was in 38, so we're dealing with, spoiler alert, this must be a significant year. March of 1938, a key event historically, and that was the Anschluss, the joining of Austria and Germany under Hitler's guidance. So Austria and Germany unite, and that created an interesting reaction. For every action, there's a reaction. The reaction here was in Poland, and Poland decided that if these countries, Austria and Germany, were going to unite, that they better be ready for something, which is that over the previous several decades, an estimated 50 to 60,000 Polish Jews had emigrated and left Poland looking for work, and they left and they went to Germany, and they were working in Germany. The fear by the Poles then was that these people were going to want to come back. And they didn't want them back. Nobody wanted them, right? So that was their action, was to block their citizenship and leave them as people without a country. Well, this is the March of 1938. If you're familiar with 1938, this is the year of the Munich Agreement. The Munich Agreement was the one where Neville Chamberlain was the one who came back and said, hey, we have peace in our lifetime. It led to Hitler taking more territory in Czechoslovakia, but also was perceived as a sign to Hitler that no one was going to stop them from doing anything. So one of his actions then was deportation. I was going to try and stay away from politics, but I'm going to tell you that this was what their version of mass deportation, which is they took 17,000 Jews and they rounded them up. And they rounded them up and they took them to the train station in Germany, and then they literally dumped them in Poland. And the Poles were not ready for them, they weren't prepared for them, they didn't want them, and they didn't treat them correctly. So in deplorable conditions, these people tried to exist. And now let me introduce you to another character in this story, and this is Herschel Grienspan. Herschel Grienspan, maybe you know the name, but Herschel Grienspan was a young man. If you look at the dates, this is 1938. He's only 17 years old. 17-year-old guy born in Hanover, Germany. So why does a 17-year-old guy, I mean, at this point in 1936, he's 15. Why does a 15-year-old guy move to Paris? Well, I told you, because it wasn't possible to comfortably live in Germany as a young kid. Now, my father was a terrific kid, the Wunder kid. This guy was apparently rather a difficult sort, angry sort, but still, being in Germany was not the right place for him, so he ended up there. Paris. Herschel Grienspan had parents. They were Polish immigrants, and they were part of that group that was rounded up and dumped in Poland. Herschel Grienspan finds out about this, and he gets upset, and he decides it's time to take matters into his own hands, time that the world should know how people are being treated. So this 17-year-old kid decides he's going to take matters into his own hands. He's angry, he gets a gun, and he heads toward the German embassy in Paris. Who does he find there? He was looking for the ambassador. Ambassador wasn't there, but he found this guy. This is Ernst von Roth, a diplomat in the German embassy in Paris. So what does he do? He shoots him. He shoots him a couple times, and a couple days later, he dies. What day is that? It's November 9th of 1938. What happened then? Well, this is what happened then. This is the beginning of Kristallnacht, which meant that if one Jew killed one German, then every Jewish person in Germany needed to suffer. And this was part of their suffering. This, as reported on November 11th, a day later, realizing that, it took time to publish these things. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle, and somehow my mic's in the way, or something's in the way here, but you can see here that it says, in Leipzig, the Jewish Bamberger and Hertz department store burned to the ground, and the proprietors, the owners, were arrested and accused of arson to collect insurance. That's how that transpired. This is what this building looked like. Now, I showed you the Königsbau, and you have to, it's not the greatest picture, but it's certainly recognizable that you can see this building, the so-called Kaufhaus Bamberger and Herz in Leipzig. That's what it looked like, burned to the ground. So that's what it looked like from the outside. But I mentioned that my father had a young sister, Steffi was her name, and Steffi recalled in her memoirs, which is called A Train Journey to Life, she recalled this, and I've excerpted some of that for you here today, and I'm just going to read it for you because it's pretty powerful and pretty significant. And it says, on November 10th, that's today, at 4 a.m., there was a loud pounding on our door. I woke up in panic. The pounding was so strong that I thought the walls of our apartment would fall in a minute. My room was closest to the door, and Poppy, due to his handicap, could not get out of bed quickly and needed my mutti's assistance. I went to the door and opened it. 3 or 4 terrifying Gestapo officers stood in front of me. Finally, Poppy was ready to go. He started walking slowly, following them. There was a stairwell leading to our home on the first floor with a round railing to hold on to. In spite of the Gestapo hasting him along, my Poppy went slowly down the stairs, 1 step at a time, maintaining his dignity. At some point, Mutti ran to him and whispered, "You know what, Ludwig, trip over. Maybe this way they will leave you alone." But Poppy refused. His pride would not let him, and he said, "No, I will go with him." She goes on to say, in a profound way, she says, "During this horrible night, followed by the silent morning, the Germans understood that no one would stop them from hurting the Jews. And that day it hit me that the Jews of Germany had no one who actually cared about them." This is a very powerful couple paragraphs, and I will tell you that afterward, we've copied for you the 5 or 6 page recollection that she wrote, and I'm going to give you the homework assignment to read it because we've got enough copies for people. It's really a powerful statement. So now, the family knows that they got a problem, not just financially, as far as the business is concerned, but with the safety of their kids. And as you know, kids come first, right? So here's my Aunt Steffi, my father's sister, grandfather, grandmother, and they had to figure out what they were going to do with little Steffi. And they were really fortunate that there was an effort in this world, and that was what's called the Kindertransport. You all know about the Kindertransport. Well, my aunt was fortunate to be one of those. She went on to live in England, later on moved to Israel, and we can pick up her story at a later point. And I will tell you that I have that book, and it's going to be on display for you later. Tell you also, just as a little bit of a statistic here. Does anybody know roughly, and Michelle can't answer this question, roughly how many kids were part of the Kindertransport? Okay, well, if I heard 10,000, it's about right. It's about 10,000, plus or minus. Does anybody know how many kids, Jewish kids, were killed in the Holocaust? It's 1.5 million, I heard it. And I calculated out that's like 0.6%. So as much as it's an absolutely heroic effort to save these kids, it's really just a drop in the bucket. Most of the kids didn't survive. So now we have a situation where my aunt is relatively safe. She ended up in the British countryside, away from the bombing. That's my aunt. My father is protected by the Alps. He's in Switzerland. So now the family can pay a little bit of attention to finances, to business. And they did. As responsible business people, they had fire insurance. So in this response from the Minister of Fire in Dresden, Dresden is in Saxony, the region that Leipzig is in, they got this response, and I'll give you the translated version, which says, at the time of the damage, the Königsbau in Leipzig was property of the Königsbau AG. That's why I told you about that administrative structure. Property of the Königsbau AG, and thus owned by a legal entity that is solely owned by Jews. All foreclosures and actions that were officially reported and executed against Jewish property from November 8, 1938 onwards are backed by the German law and thus not eligible for compensation. Additionally, The Königsbau AG is also not eligible for any type of compensation, as otherwise the Jews would not make atonement for the murder of a member of the German embassy in Paris. That's the official government edict, and as you know from the history here, what the Germans did is they created laws and then they enforced them. They didn't just make this stuff up. They cited statutes which supported that. Now, some of you have probably heard, I'm sure you have, of what we would call the Alliance. We would call it Alliance, the insurance company. It's one of the largest insurance companies in the world. Actually, it's a German company. And their response, citing that statute that supported them, was if the Jews were to collect insurance, then the rightful indignation of the German people against them would be of no impact. The Jews must suffer the punishment they deserve. So that led to the complete dissolution of the business. Actually, what happened was that there was a mandated sale of the business, and the mandated sale was such that it was a price that was way below market value, and any profits were frozen, not accessible to the family. So it left them destitute. We're going to come back to the situation in Germany, but now I want to pick up the next part of this, which is I'm going to go back to Switzerland, because when we left Switzerland, I left my father in Switzerland as a 15 or 16-year-old. So he's in Switzerland now. He's got to do something. You know, what should he do? Why not stay there? That'd be a good idea, right? Stay in Switzerland. It's beautiful. It's beautiful in the picture now, and it was more beautiful in reality. Why not stay there? Problem. The Swiss didn't want them. So this is a letter. It's in French, and basically says that you have until July 31st of 1941 to finish your business. Finish your business meaning your student visa is going to be terminated, and as a reason, because there's a superpopulation. My French is not good enough to say this, but basically that meant an overpopulation of immigrants in Switzerland. So the Swiss were not going to keep my father. They weren't going to keep any immigrants. The Swiss did not want to be the repository of German Jews, or any Jews. So what to do? Well, I'm going to tell you that my father started to let it be known that he had to go someplace, and he was going to look for opportunities elsewhere, including the U.S. So here comes his beloved uncle Gustav, the uncle who was in many ways thought of as the wisest of all of the uncles. He was a very worldly guy. They all trusted his judgment. They loved the guy. When I say they, all the cousins. And what he said in this letter, he concludes with the following. This is October of 1939. He says, "In the end, I would like to comment on your plan to emigrate to the U.S. From my personal viewpoint, I would not try to force anything right now, and instead observe the current developments." Nobody in Germany or any part of the world knew what was coming, right? So when you hear people say, well, why didn't they leave? Well, because many of them didn't have anywhere to go, for one. For two, they said, you know what, it's bad, but it's going to blow over, right? It's going to pass. Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. And that was his position in October 1939. Now, my father revered his uncle. So he wasn't doing anything that was disrespectful, but he realized he had to do something. He had until July 31st of 1941 to figure out where he was going to go. So he went and he applied to schools, and he decided he was a good student. He applied to schools across the world, but this one in particular, University of Chicago. The University of Chicago had a program that accepted him, and it says the University of Chicago has granted to Mr. Bamberger a full tuition scholarship of $300 for the academic year. All right, but that's pretty good. That was the original full ride, okay? Point is, he had a place to go, right? Except for one thing. What's he missing? The answer was visa. He doesn't have a visa, okay? So he's got to go get that. So he lets it be known to the University of Chicago that he's having some problems. They write back and they say, we have received a letter from Mr. Samler informing us that your request for a student visa was refused by the American consul. We thought that this might be for financial reasons. So for this reason, we are sending you a new provisional certificate of admission, including a statement of the financial help which the university is offering you. For the academic year 1939 to 40, we hope you will be successful in obtaining a visa and that you will be able to come to this university this year. Did it work? No is the right answer. It didn't work. So he's still searching for a visa. He writes in 1940, while he's still struggling, and he says, "Today, I beg to apply to you as my situation in Switzerland has suddenly become very difficult. I am forced to enter a working camp for immigrants on July 31st, as it is still impossible for me to leave this country. I don't yet know if, under which conditions I will be free again, and I am therefore obliged to beg you to try to accelerate my immigration visa. This is the only certain way for me to come out of this country again." Did that work? And the answer is no. And here is a very sobering letter. Comes again from the University of Chicago, dated 1941. It says, "We're sorry for the many difficulties that have arisen in connection with this award, which was made to you last year. I am sorry that we can do nothing further about it. It is not expected that the refugee scholarship will be available during the entire year, during the coming year. We regret not being able to help you further." Doors shut. He's got no way out, right? I don't know if Robbie's here, but I'm going to tell you, if Robbie's not here, I will tell you that in came the angel from heaven. The angel from heaven was a distant relative by the name of Millie Lowinger. And Millie Lowinger wrote the following. She wrote that I am willing to do anything that is necessary so that he will not become a burden on any public charity or relief agency. She lived in Minneapolis. She was a distant relative of my father. She was a courageous person who was willing to support my father and others. Not support them, but guarantee that they would not be a burden to society, because the U.S. did not want people coming in here and being charity cases. So now, with that, and some time and some work, he got his visa. He got his ticket out. There's a follow-up. I told you that his beloved uncle, the wise one, writes to my father. He says, now this is June 31st of 1941. The other was from 39. The tone has changed. Now he says, more satisfying was the report on your soon-to-come departure to the U.S. For you, I can only wish you the best on your journey. I am certain that you will find your way in the world, and I hope that you can establish yourself well enough to bring your parents and sister to the United States. I am looking forward to a future in which all four Saxons are reunited, and a Berliner will also be able to visit you frequently. Signed by Gustav. So the tone has changed. Now it went from let's let this blow over to get out, get there, and send me a lifeboat. So now what are you going to do? Now he's got a visa, he's got his exit. Now he's got to get out of the country, out of Switzerland. He's got to get to the U.S. Here's Switzerland. What's your way out? The world's at war. Germany's at war. France is occupied. But there was a spot that was still open to him, and that was in Spain. So he managed to get himself from Switzerland, trains and buses, to Lisbon. And Lisbon, then, he had to find transport across the ocean. So he's in the middle of Lisbon. The clock is ticking. And I say the clock is ticking because the Portuguese were okay with you staying there for a while, but there was a limit, a cutoff. So he had to make tracks. He had to make a plan. He had to get out of there. So he has a choice. He found two ships. One of them was the Nyassa, nice passenger ship, and the other was this one here called the Melange. And the Melange was a Portuguese freighter with a load that was cork. So if you knew my father, you would know that, of course, he would take the nice shiny one with probably a first-class berth on it. But that's not what happened, because he figured and he determined that there was a little bit more certainty as far as the departure of this ship was concerned. So he went for the melange, and eventually he got to the U.S. Dated July 21st, 1941. If you look here in the fine print, you can see that they identified Heinz Bamberger, a Swiss, as part of this group. And I left this specifically in this format. This was the way I found this piece of this newspaper clipping and the bunting around it. And as I've said to others, I said, you know, this was indicative of how proud he was to be a U.S. citizen. Managed to put this bunting around. This was a great celebration. The United States had allowed me to come here. That was terrific. I've said to others that this was the time when, for the rest of his life, he felt indebted, and he had two things in his two homes that I knew of. Two things. One is, on the doorpost of his house, he had a mezuzah, and at least in his second house, upon thy gate, he had a flag holder, and he would fly that flag on those holidays. And I've said to others, I've asked the question, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think I know, but I don't know for sure. I don't know what he would do today about flying the flag. Something he was proud of at the time, and I don't know what it would be like right now. And I'll tell you another piece of information. I mentioned those two ships, the Melange and the Nyassa. Well, as he found out, the Nyassa never made it. The Nyassa was recommissioned for the Portuguese military. So had he opted for that, nobody knows what would have happened to him. Sometimes it's judgment, sometimes it's luck. So that was July. Let me go back here for just a second. That's July. He's landing in the East Coast. And one of his uncle Siegfried, otherwise known as Fritz or Fred, he had managed to survive and get to the United States and get to Los Angeles. So it was upon his advice that my father came west. The idea was that Los Angeles was nicer, right? And it had more opportunity. And with all due respect to his fellow immigrants, it wasn't as crowded there. So the feeling was he had more opportunity, and he did in fact come to Los Angeles, California, where he managed to set up shop. That was July. 3 months later, I told you that he was born September 8th of 1920. 3 months later, he's about to have his 21st birthday. And somehow, and I don't know the exact timing of how these letters got to him, but he says he gets a letter from Poppy, his father, who says, last but not least, I want to remind you that as soon as you have managed to establish yourself at least a little bit, you should inform us as to the opportunities to leave for Cuba or Ecuador. Get us out, help us figure out how we can get out of Germany because we're stuck. That was September, October, November, and then December, a day that changed the world. This was Pearl Harbor Day. The U.S. enters the war, and the world changes. But it changed in another way, which was this, was suddenly the U.S. was formally afraid of immigrants, such that they established this rule, establishing that people who were from Germany, Italy, or Japan established the new criteria of enemies or aliens of enemy nationalities. They weren't full citizens at this point. Restrictions such as these. Aliens of enemy nationalities are prohibited from having in their possession, custody, or control from operating certain prohibited articles. These prohibited articles include, among other things, radio transmitters, shortwave radio receiving sets, cameras, and firearms. It's a whole new status for a group of people who had fled this kind of persecution. So what was that like for a young man? Well, in July of 1942, he wrote to one of his friends. He says, "As far as I'm concerned, I think my present activity is the best you can find right now and is the least affected by the somewhat annoying and discouraging alien problems." Things were rather unpleasant during these last months, with curfew after 8 o'clock for so-called enemy aliens. We all thought having finally escaped this kind of discrimination, but of course we must still be happier than ever to be in this country. So that's 1942 for my father and his fellow immigrants. And now I'm going to take you back to Germany. But before I take you back to Germany, I want to present to you one of the obstacles that people had in the world at that time, which was communication. It was really difficult. You know, the people tried to write letters. That's the way they could communicate. You couldn't pick up the phone. And he wrote, here's a copy of a letter, excuse me, this is the envelope that my father, H.J. Heinz Jakob, had written to his father in Leipzig, Germany. But what you see is it says, "Return to sender, service suspended." You're stuck. He has no way of knowing what's going on in Germany. So they got a little bit creative, and my father had a friend, a non-Jewish friend who he went to school with. His name was Jean-Pierre von Wurstenberger. And Jean-Pierre served as a liaison, if you will, for the family. My father would write to him, and he would then forward information to his parents and vice versa. So in April of 1942, my grandfather, Ludwig, my father's father, writes to Mr. von Wurstenberger. He says, "I usually have the opportunity to write about good news. Unfortunately, this is not the case, as we have not even been able to pursue our main goal to finally leave the country. As all paths are blocked, it seems that the only option we have is to wait until the war finally ends, as at this moment we cannot find a single ray of hope." And he goes on to say, it's a long letter, and I just excerpted some of it. "6 months ago, I switched my profession. I stopped working as a merchant and started repairing shoes as a cobbler in our local community." So here's my grandfather, a merchant, a prosperous individual owning a big store. Now it's relegated to the role of being a shoe cobbler. But that's the way they had to exist. So if that was bad, it gets worse. Now here's my grandfather, Ludwig, writing to a friend. We think the friend was in Switzerland, and he says, this is September of 1942. He says, "A few months ago, they started the transport of our Jewish community. The first one affected in our community was Aunt Matilda, followed by Anna and Siegfried." That was his sister and brother-in-law, "who were deported 2 weeks ago. My wife and I will be next, as our transport is scheduled for September 19th. And the best part about this upcoming journey is that we will probably head toward the same place Anna and Siegfried were brought to." We don't know exactly, how comfortable he was expressing all of his concerns, but that's the way he placed it. And where was that place? The place was Theresienstadt. Now, Theresienstadt, for those of you who know, was part of Nazi propaganda. And it was part of Nazi propaganda both internally in Germany and externally. Internally, to the Jews, it was presented as kind of a retirement community where they were going to be able to live out their lives. So they were going to be able to go with the elite part, the leadership, the intellectuals, to this wonderful community, and they would be protected and spared any further trauma. That was internal to Germany. That's how they got the people such as the grandparents to just load up the trains and go. Externally, this is the camp, if you recall, this is the camp where they had the phony structures and these performances that were all designed to make it look like this was, for the Red Cross, make it look like this was a lovely place. But in reality, it wasn't a lovely place. It was a place where the conditions weren't good, and where if they got too crowded, they shipped you off to Auschwitz. But the other issue was, if you were such a person, such as my grandfather, who had some kind of disability, your chance of surviving was not great. So lo and behold, in this letter that comes from my grandmother from Theresienstadt on June 27th of 1943, it says, I told you about Jean-Pierre. So here's Jean-Pierre, and my grandmother wrote that, full of grief, I have to tell you that my husband, Ludwig, passed away on December 8th of 1942, which means he didn't make it but 3 months in this camp. That was Theresienstadt. Moving on, I'm going to tell you that in 1944, in many ways, a wish came true. My father then was able to join the U.S. Army. He was officially Henry James Bamberger, and that was 1944. And for those of you who know, you probably know the story, but I will ask, if you were the U.S. Army and you had a guy who spoke French, German, and English fluently, where the heck would you send him?
Intelligence.
Intelligence. Well, intelligence would be good, but in the South Pacific, it didn't work so well. They sent him to the South Pacific. And you know what? My father never resented it, because I think at the time the idea was, you're just part of bodies. We need numbers over there. And that was how he spent the rest of the war. He was proudly able to say that during this event, which was D-Day, he was proudly able to say that he was on some ship someplace and was able to translate some of the communications that they were able to pick up via shortwave radio about the events that were going on in Germany, because he would be able to sit in the front, and there are not that many people who were able to speak those languages and pick up the talk. So that's June of 1944, and we know in retrospect that this was a major turning point in the war. Right? The U.S. the Allied forces were gaining a stronghold. They were gaining ground on the Germans. So there was hope here that someday he could reunite with his mother. In early that year, 1944, my father, and I think actually my mother wrote this check, but he gave a $5 contribution to the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And he got this lovely letter back. This is February of 1945 now. It's in response to your letter, we are glad to be able to inform you that your mother's name is included in our list of internees in Theresienstadt, and that food packages have been sent to her. That was the image that these people had. That says, okay, it was a camp. It was like, it couldn't be too bad. It was some sort of prison, and they may benefit from having some cakes or food packages sent to them. They really didn't know what was going on, but that was the image, was, hey, this is great, there's progress. Maybe my mother can be found. Well, it got better, because by 1945, a little bit later, the Germans were on the ropes. So much so that they were willing to do something, which was swap prisoners for money. And they released 1,200 Theresienstadt prisoners in exchange for 5 million Swiss francs. 1,200 Jews reached Switzerland in February of 1945. That's great. However, maybe my father thinks, maybe my mother is one of them, only to find out that it was not the case. A friend of a contact, these people were they did everything they could to contact people, and they found out that a few days ago, friends of Mrs. Bamberger could enter Switzerland, and wrote to me that Steffi, my aunt, that his mother died last June in Theresienstadt. So while my father is thinking that there's D-Day and that there's progress and there's hope and they could free him, she had already passed. That's the way the communication was. That was the environment that they lived in. We'll tell you also, in the spirit that we all have heard about, which is there are people who are survivors who like to talk about stuff, and there are people who didn't like to talk about stuff. My father, I have to say, was a little bit of a hybrid there, but I have no idea where he was when he got that news. And I don't know what his reaction was, because he never spoke about it. Similarly, he didn't speak about what happened then, which is May of that year. May of that year, the war in Europe is over. When I say similarly, I never heard from either my mother or my father, and many of you may be in the same situation. What did they think? How did they find out about what was going on with all this stuff around the Holocaust Museum? All these horrific pictures and images. What were they thinking at the time? I don't know. My parents never talked about it. That was the way they approached it. But that was May of that year. That means we're making progress here. By August, we have the end of World War II. The atomic bomb had been exploded, and we were able to celebrate. So now what? Well, if you're familiar with the times, you'll know that if the war is over, we in the U.S. had somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 million troops who were in the South Pacific. You couldn't just hop them all on a ship and send them back, so it took months to get back. But months passed, my father came back, and the question is, what now? So my father, by the time that my father came back in December, the plans were already on a marriage at the Beverly Hills Hotel. On March 31st, 1946, we had this event. This is my mother and my father, and I put this one up there to make a point here, which is these are smiling faces. This is just a few months after they had returned, and less than a year after they found out what happened to their family members. And specifically, this is my father who lost his parents. This is my father's first cousin whose parents also went to Theresienstadt, and they died. My mother lost multiple aunts. So somehow, these people were resilient enough to move forward. How they did that, if you just think back to like 9 months ago and think about moving forward and after that kind of tragedy, I don't know how they did it, but that generation did. So what's next? Someone once said, well, did my father, did he go back to the University of Chicago? No, he didn't. It was time to move forward. So moving forward, here's a family picture, and I see in the back of the room my brother here, my brother John Ludwig Bamberger, and I am Mark Gustav Bamberger, and that's my mother and my father. So that's the name, those are the names that we carry with us. But while we were worried about, what was for lunch and why do I have to wear these overalls, my father had one other thing on his mind. And in a letter that he wrote, and he wrote this letter to the adopting parents of my aunt in England. And he was recalling the fact that there was a small settlement that the Germans had made with the family for money that was in the name of hundreds of dollars for some property that was left untouched. And the West Germans were actually pretty good about this stuff, but money was not that great at the time. So they sent them a few $100s, and my father was explaining that to the adopting mother of my aunt. But what he went on to say was what Steffi and I must wait for in order to realize more substantial amounts is German unification. Our interests lie in what is now the Soviet zone. In the Soviet Union and in the East German communist government, there is no private property. So that when my father, who knew this history well, was thinking about this property, the Königsbau, which he felt was taken from the family illegally, he could argue with the East Germans that this was theirs, that it's their property. But there is no property, so you're stuck. Nobody owns it. The state owns it. So there was nothing that they could do other than wait. But for my father, it was kind of like, I always looked at this as like a pilot light burning in the background. It's on just in case something else happens. But life went forward. That was the 50s. My parents loved to travel. They went back to their stomping grounds of Europe. They loved to go places like France. There's my father revisiting Venice, a place he loved as a kid. They never went to Germany for pleasure, by the way, but they loved to go to Europe. And then my father, here he is in Switzerland. He loved Switzerland even though he could have resented Switzerland for not keeping him, but he loved Switzerland. And that was the 1970s. And then I'm going to move on to this picture here, which I don't know if I can play it, but I don't think I can. Well, let's see. Anyway, this is 1980. This was Lake Placid, New York. And I put this up just as a timepiece, just for reference, just so you can put this into perspective and see where we were as a country. This was not a political statement. The U.S. didn't beat the Soviet Union. They just beat them in hockey. Interestingly, it was 1980, which makes it like 44 years ago. That's a long time, but it seems like yesterday. I find it interesting that at the time it reflects our lack of knowledge of what the Soviet Union was about, because we beat the Soviet Union, but it gets reported as we beat the Russians. Today, with everything that's going on in the world and Ukraine, we realize that the Soviet Union does not equal Russia. But that was the beginning of the 1980s, and I put that as a time marker. So moving on, what then happened in the 1980s, for those of you who remember history, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europeans were starting to realize that the communist model that they had created and believed in wasn't keeping up. They weren't keeping up with the Western economies. So they had to make change. So here comes Mikhail Gorbachev, whose main principles were that of glasnost, which meant to be more open, and perestroika, which was to restructure. And his idea then was that in order for the Soviet Union to catch up with the West, and they were falling behind, they needed to make change. Into the mix comes this guy, who I hope we can play. See if it works.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
I will tell you that my father was not a big...
Whoa,
what happened? My father was not a big Reaganite, but he liked that speech. Who wouldn't? The guy could deliver a message. So that speech, that atmosphere was received in other parts of the world very well. The atmosphere was such that the Soviet Union was starting to crumble. And in a place that we've talked about, which is Leipzig, Germany, there was a revolution that was starting. And the revolution became known as the Monday demonstration. And in a church that was right off of the Gustavsplatz, it's called the St. Nicholas Church, or the Nikolai Kirche, there were these demonstrations. They were called the Monday demonstrations. The Monday demonstrations started as a small group of people, a group of people who were politicians, religious leaders, and community leaders. And they got together and they were starting to figure out how they could get change in their country, how they could get their country back to where it was and equal to the West. And don't forget, at the time, communication was starting to improve. So these people in the East were starting to see what was going on in the West and why people on the other side of the wall had it so much better. So they started these meetings. They were called the Monday demonstration. It started off as small groups, and it grew and it grew. And then they started to have like public marches. And these people actually were fearing their lives, thinking that the East German police were going to meet them with violence. But for reasons that we don't know, maybe the historians in the group do, they didn't stop them. So that by the time they got to October of 1989, the Monday demonstrations had morphed into something called the Peaceful Revolution. And by October 9th of 1989, an estimated 70,000 people gathered in this place in East Germany, the Augustusplatz, right here, and here is the building that we've spoken about, the Königsbau. 70,000 people there. There were more in Berlin. And what happened? What was the result? Well, the East Germans achieved what they wanted, which was the tearing down of the Berlin Wall. The gates were open, the wall was being chipped away physically, and what's really an amazing coincidence, and nobody really can explain this, but the amazing coincidence is that happened on November 9th of 1989, the exact anniversary of Kristallnacht. If you believe in divine powers, maybe it has something to do with it, I don't know, but it's an interesting coincidence. So now you have the wall coming down, and in motion was this, the actual reunification of Germany. The Germans like to call it reunification as opposed to unification, because unification implies that it's the first time. This was, no, we're just getting back together. We should have been together all along. So that's September of 1990, a formal ceremony for the world to see that Germany was now being reunified. So now we have an issue here, which is if Germany is being reunified and the East is now becoming part of the West, or they're becoming together, the East were now subject to Western laws. Now we turn to my father again, who remembered this statement, this concept, which was at the time of the damage of the Königsbau in Leipzig, that was the property of the Königsbau AG. That's the statement that he brought back, and that comes from October 1989. So here's a situation where my father, being approximately 70 years old at the time, fluent in German and English, and as knowledgeable as anyone, more knowledgeable than most about what had transpired. He went to bat. And I told you about that sense that I have that he had a little pilot light in his belly, pilot light about, gee, what could happen? Well, this was like turning on the gas here. So my father, who those people in the room would know was just the nicest person known to man, well, he wasn't nice about this. He was persistent and determined. And even though he met resistance, he was ultimately able, on behalf of the Königsbau AG, not himself, but the Königsbau AG, all of the heirs, he was able to reobtain ownership of this property. It was a big deal. So what to do with it? Well, he was offered the opportunity of like leading some sort of development, but at that point he was not about to be a German businessman. So on behalf of the family, meaning all of the heirs of the Königsbau AG, the actual Freundlichen Herren had passed by that point, but there were multiple relatives, descendants. On behalf of them, he got what was durable power of attorney, power of attorney to sell the building, which he did. And to the realtors in this group, they'll understand the idea, and maybe all of you. With the help of realtors and attorneys, the building was for sale, and they entertained buyers. And I say on behalf of realtors and those of you who have sold property in your life, you know that number one when you're selling is to get the good price, right? We know that. But it also feels good if you're selling a house, if someone says, I love what you did with the house. The lighting's great, the bathrooms are great, you did such a wonderful thing, it's great, we love it. Only to find out after that they're going to mow it down, right? Okay? So they told my father, you know, we like the history of the building, we want to buy this thing, and besides, we're going to make a tribute to the family as part of our sale. And we say, yeah, fat chance. But in fact, lo and behold, by 2003, the building had been refurbished. It had been refurbished, it had been renovated, but they kept the exact facade on the outside. And in that facade was a dedication ceremony attended here by my aunt, Steffi, my father, and my mother. And these somber faces were there as they listened to this speech, a speech by one of the great names of Germany, which is Wolfgang Stuttenbrink, who was the director of the company that bought the property. And he says, the attack on Bamberger and Hertz shows what destructive potential can be launched by an evil, irresponsible regime. On the other hand, the Monday demonstrations of the fall of 1989 also show us what can be accomplished by people who want to lead a free life. So that future generations may learn of the varied history of this building, this plaque is being unveiled in memory of the Bamberger family and their life's work. That's the plaque that's to be unveiled, and the somber faces are replaced by rather happy faces as they unveiled this plaque. So now, not that long after, my family and I got to travel with my parents to Leipzig, and here is my father. Here is the plaque right there, and here is my father looking at the plaque. And if you knew my father, you know that he was not too demonstrative of his emotions, but you can see that here's a gentleman who's welling up. And what he's thinking at the time as he looks at it, it's hard to know, but it's got to be an overwhelming experience, and that's my father looking up at this plaque. And what does the plaque say? I will translate it for you, and it says, "In memory of the Bamberger family, the owners of this property and the business, Bamberger and Hertz, whose life's work was destroyed on November 9th of 1938 in the Kristallnacht." So if you go to Leipzig someday and you stand on the Augustusplatz and you see this building and you walk up closer, you'll see the plaque right there. And then you will see and know the story of the Königsbau on the Augustusplatz. So with that, I'm going to finish and hope that you have found this interesting. I hope you learned something. But above all, I hope that you can feel, as I do, that keeping these stories, the big picture stories, alive is vital to our existence. So thank you very much.